My name is Jill Latson, and I'm the current director of the writing program, and it's so nice to see many of you here. On behalf of the WAS and myself, I'd like to welcome you to the first Alumni Weekend, this one in celebration of the first 25 years of the program. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to Tom Blackburn, who started this. An exciting time for the WA program. As we continue to meet the needs of student writers through the Course WA program and Writing Center, we also have begun several initiatives, and I realized just this year, as I was putting this together. This year we launched an online scheduling system. So now students, any time of day or night, can make an appointment to come to the Writing Center. We don't conference with them 24 hours a day, even though they would like that. But somewhere we have to draw the line. But it has actually sort of changed the dynamics of how people are coming to the Writing Center. We also this year started partnering with the College Access Center of Delaware County, where the WAs are going into Chester, working with students in two different programs. One is a drop-in writing center, and one with a program called Roadmap, working with sort of pre-college 9th through 12th graders, getting them ready to enter college. And we're also about to launch a pilot program where students will receive feedback on presentations. And I think I could have probably used this service that was in place. And we pretty much worked out the logistics, except for maybe what to call these, what acronym we should use for these particular people. So we were wondering, are they PAWS, Presentation Associates, CMAs, Communication Associates, or my personal favorite, SPAs, or Speaking Associates? For now, we've decided to stay as Writing Associates who have a specialty in working with oral communication. So I hope over the next few days, the returning WA alums will learn how the program has evolved since the beginning, and that the current WAs will learn, as Sarah's been calling, the WA lore, or the roots of the program. Last spring, when we decided to put this event together that would bring WA alums back to campus while celebrating our current program, I remember we brainstormed a lot of ideas. There was the WA formal, which was to include ballroom dancing. I bet you're glad I vetoed that one. There was the WA sleepover in the center. Or that might just be the idea that they present to me every year. Instead, we decided to put together a program that would highlight what it means to be a WA and combine it with what we, to highlight our current program and what WAs are doing now post-Swarthmore. Sarah Foster and I would sit in my office weekly looking over this big spreadsheet of WA alums saying, who would be interesting to bring? And we quickly encountered the problem that everyone was interesting to bring, which is how we wound up with the exciting panels that we have scheduled tomorrow. So we've been getting asked, like, how did you develop this program? And a lot of it was just, we just kept asking and people kept saying yes. And then we couldn't say no, and so it just sort of grew. I'm sure that this won't be the first time, but I'd like to take a moment to thank Sarah for all the work that she's done. Last week I decided to send personal reminders to all the WA alums, especially the ones that I knew, in hopes of getting many people back to campus for this event. I quickly received back over 100 responses with some version of, Jill, it's so great to hear from you. What a great idea. Unfortunately, I can't come because I'm fill in the blank. And so this, these messages were sort of bittersweet because it was great to hear how well everybody was doing, but I was starting to get a little disappointed about, that people couldn't make it. And panic began to set in because I knew Sarah worked so hard and I wanted to make sure. What if no one comes to the event? So I decided to get away from the computer and go out to dinner with a friend. And as we completed our meal, I broke open a fortune cookie to find a message that read, perceived failure is oftentimes success trying to be born in a bigger way. I don't typically take cues from desserts, but in this case it helped me refocus on what matters. I started to actually see the impact of what this event was having, even if people couldn't make it. All of a sudden, WA alums were discovering that not only were they in the same city, but perhaps the same department at the same school. Or someone would say, I'm thinking of starting a writing center, do you know anything about it? And I would be like, here are 3 people that you can contact. And so there's actually a lot of conversation going on outside of this event. This morning I was touched to read on my Facebook wall, which will be surprising for any of you coming out that I actually have a Facebook wall, from Ben Bradlow, who some of you know, that said, some of us WA alums are due to be meeting up in Cape Town, South Africa this weekend. We'll be thinking of the WA crew. Being a WA for many remains a part of a student's worth of identity, way beyond when they graduate. And we don't need them in the Shoya room on a Friday night, a very hot Friday night, for us to understand the reach of the program. More importantly, after reading this fortune, I started to think about how that statement applies to why or writing. How often do we walk away from a conference feeling like we may not have helped a student, or a student come to us thinking that their paper just wasn't good enough? I hope throughout this weekend, and as we continue while both on and off campus, that we think about our role in birthing someone else's and our own success. Here's to a successful weekend. It is now my pleasure to introduce one of our current WAs, Joanna Venator, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, Jill. As Jill said, my name is Joanna Venator. I'm a sophomore in law here at Swarthmore. And I have the immense pleasure of working as a law with our speaker tonight, Professor Ken Sharp of the Political Science Department. Even in our first meeting, it was clear that not only did Professor Sharp care about writing, he cared about the writing process and using it as a tool, which, as I'm sure all of you know, is very near to the law's hearts. Professor Sharp himself has a very strong background in many different types of writing, varying from a book based on anthropological research, peasant politics, struggle in the Dominican Republic, to interviews with corporate executives in his book, The State and Transnational Corporations, The Political Economy of the Mexican Auto Industry, to op-ed pieces and newspaper articles. Most recently, Professor Sharp has published a book, co-authored a book with Professor Schwartz in the psychology department here at Swarthmore entitled Practical Wisdom, The Right Way to Do the Right Thing, from which, as you may have noticed, the lecture derives its name. Professor Sharp has been involved in the Writing Associate program from its very inception. He participated in the faculty debate and vote on the program 25 years ago, and he has used the law every year since. A few years ago, he was also very instrumental in the redesignation of the Course Law program funding as an educational fellowship, to which we're very grateful to him for. His support for both the writing program and for writing in the Swarthmore community as a whole has been extraordinary, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Ken Sharp.
So here's a great topic for a talk about the Writing Associates program at Swarthmore. It could be called The Impact of the WA Program on Improving Student Writing at the College. We could look at the history of the program since it was first organized by the faculty after some very contentious faculty meetings with questions from the faculty like, how pray tell can students teach students how to write? Or how will we prevent them from just writing each other's papers? Remember these discussions, John? We could look at the early pioneers and the later directors who actually turned the idea into reality, like Tom Blackburn and Francis Bolton and Lisa Smullian. And of course, we could look at the tremendous positive impact the WA program has had on writing across the curriculum. Worthy as such talk might be, my concern tonight is different. I want to focus on a less noticed but remarkable impact the WA program has had, which is its impact on all of you, the WAs. What I find particularly remarkable is the ways that it has caused you to learn how to teach. Not just teach others how to write, not just teach like school teachers or teach like college professors. No, I mean teach in the broadest sense. In most of the work we all do, and in our lives as friends and as colleagues and as citizens, we're constantly called on to teach others. I think one of the unsung blessings of the WA program is that it has caused you to learn to be better citizen teachers. And tonight, I will argue that it has done this by causing you to learn the practical wisdom that good teaching demands. Caused you to learn. Now there's an awkward phrase that any good WA would probably circle on my paper. Well, why not just say, the WA program has taught you to be good teachers, or has taught you practical wisdom? I asked that same question to a group of Harvard Medical School doctor-teachers who practice at a community hospital in Cambridge. For days, I had been hearing them say, we're causing our students to learn good judgment. In a few minutes, I'll tell you what they said. But let me start with a story that was told to me by one third-year Harvard medical student in that program. His name is Michael Morse, and he too is a veteran of the Swarthmore WA program. The third year at any medical school is a time that students move out of their academic studies and move on to the hospital wards to get hands-on experience to start their training. And I had just asked Michael whether the third-year program he was in involved a course in medical ethics. And I'll read you the transcript of the discussion we had, what he said. Medical ethics, Mike said, is a complex subject when you take the whole of it, but when you're doing your best to care for a patient, in partnership with the patient, and doing the research when you know you need to know more, and talking to your colleagues, and getting mentored by physicians to work better, you're probably acting as an ethical physician all the time. He talked about Alex, a diabetic patient he had been working with. I got to know Alex pretty well. He was middle-aged, he had schizophrenia half his life, and he now lived in a group home. Alex was not married. He had few people in his life close to him, but Alex did get joy out of one thing. One thing gave him great pleasure, and that was eating. And in the group home that Alex lived in, the kind of food that was always around was food like hot dogs and donuts. I knew that medications alone were not going to do the trick. I needed to find ways to counsel him, and that wasn't easy. You know that he's killing himself by eating a half a dozen donuts a day. So it's a pretty fundamental ethical question, isn't it? How to engage a patient like Alex with this truth. You could say, if you keep eating these 6 donuts a day and you look at this statistically, there's a 50-50 chance you'll be dead in 7 years. Whereas if you follow my suggestions and change your diet, you will live for 14 years. But just playing out the facts, said Michael, facts like this probably won't work. And you have an ethical obligation to explain the risks to the patient. But how? Do you just check the box on your form? I've warned the patient? Well, that may reduce your risk of being sued, but the ethical obligation is to change behavior, to allow Alex to live a healthier life. And this is exceptionally difficult. Is he not getting it? Or is there a challenge in implementing these behaviors? It's tempting to give up. But sometimes it's not because the patient is unwilling to change, but because the conversation was not done well. It requires more skill in counseling, said Mike, than many physicians have. Let's unpack this story for a minute and look at the things that Michael needed in order to treat Alex. First, of course, he needed the technical skill to diagnose the problem, to figure out that Alex suffered from diabetes. That, of course, is analogous to the technical skills that you as WAS learn about how to read a paper, right? How to diagnose the problems in grammar, paragraph structure, lack of coherence, missing evidence, failure to state the problem clearly. But then came the treatment. Michael knew that the medical fix, adjusting the dosage of insulin, would only take Alex so far. Alex needed to change his behavior. But Michael immediately faced a classic problem: what to do when two good principles of medical ethics conflict. One principle was the principle of benevolence or care. His aim as a doctor was to get Alex to do the things he needed to do to get better. But there's another guiding principle, which is patient choice. It's the patient who's ill, and the patient should be in charge of the treatments he wants to try. Anything less would be paternalism or manipulation. So, which is it? Doctor choice or patient choice? Manipulation is bad from the perspective of patient choice, but how about nudging? How about framing things so the patient is more likely to choose the right thing? And how much is the patient capable of choosing on his own, or choosing on his own right now? There was no rule that could tell Michael how directive to be. or how he should just give Alex the information and let him choose for himself. Figuring out how to balance directiveness and choice demanded that Michael learn the practical wisdom to balance these competing goods. Now, to be practically wise, Michael also had to learn to be perceptive, how to see the patient, how to see the context. What caused Alex's failure to change his eating habits? Was it lack of information? Was it a lack of understanding? Was it his living situation, the daily temptation of all those donuts? To be perceptive, Michael had to be a good listener. He had to know when to be quiet and when to ask Alex questions. And he had to know which questions to ask. Michael had to suspend his own judgments about Alex's responsibility, or lack of it, in order to understand how responsible Alex was and what could or should be done to nudge him in a healthier direction. Michael's language in talking about what he was doing was striking. He wasn't talking with words like treating or curing or prescribing. His words were counseling. Michael was learning that to be a good doctor, you also needed to be a good counselor. The distance from doctoring to wine is not as great as it first seems. To do their work well, both doctors and WAs are constantly making small ethical choices. They're involved in balancing good things that are in conflict. They're figuring out how to act rightly in complex situations, ambiguous situations that often unfold quite quickly, as all of you who have been in conferences know. A good WA, like a good doctor, needs to learn how to be a good counselor. A good WA needs practical wisdom. What do I mean? Well, let's start by thinking about how weird and strange the words are that you use to describe yourselves in your practice. Wine a paper. You go into the real world and tell people that you did that at college, at Swarthmore College, and they're going to think and look at you as if you came from Cloud Lulu land. But we say that you are WAs, engaged in the activity of wine, you're WAEs, because it's actually quite hard to describe what you practice with another simple word or phrase. No matter what words you pick, you're going to miss the complexity of what's happening. You're not editing student papers. You're not correcting their papers. At the heart of why in a paper is a delicate balancing act. You need to help another student write better, but you can't tell them exactly what they need to do. You need to help them see the problem that they're having and figure it out for themselves. Well, not really totally for themselves, because you need to guide them, but what does guide mean? Are you respecting their freedom and autonomy? Are you letting them choose for themselves? Well, not really. Are you proofreading and rewriting for them, telling them what to do? No, not really. You're nudging them, and you're doing this by respecting their choices, but also by critiquing and challenging and questioning their choices. Listen to the reflections of one WA on a recent conference. These are taken from the WA blog, where you write some of your reflections, but without your names on them. The WAE herself was very directive, and I had a tendency to get off track quickly and stay there until I practically interrupted in order to steer the conversation back on track. This was an interesting experience for me. In general, I'm very aware in conference that I tend to be directive, and I work hard to tone this back. However, in this conference, I felt sometimes like I was being obnoxiously directive. Not that I was stressing my ideas, my way of running a conference, but really just in terms of getting the YE to stick to the assignment at hand. So, how to balance YE choice and WA directiveness? When does too much choice lead the YE to go off track? When and how do you direct them to come back? Or maybe you wouldn't say direct them, maybe you'd say urge them, cajole them, nudge them. These are very delicate balances. They are the balances that teachers and often friends face dozens of times in their daily relations. In every half-hour wine session, you make dozens of small choices about what to correct and what to let the student fix, about when to critique their choices and when to respect them. It is because these balancing acts are at the heart of wine that it's hard to describe exactly what a WA does. It's hard to find another word for wine, and it's because these balancing acts are at the heart of wine that a wine needs practical wisdom in order to be a good wine. But it's not just these balancing acts that demand practical wisdom. There's more. Let me talk for a minute about generosity. It's one of the many virtues a good wine needs. You all know from your personal lives how important practical wisdom is if you want to be a generous friend or lover or parent. Take, for example, the common problem, well, what do you give as a gift? You want to be generous and thoughtful, but not too generous. That would turn the gift into an obligation for a payback or indebtedness. But too little would be stingy, embarrassing, not considerate. And then there's the content. What does he or she like, need? Cash is practical, but what will it say about you and what you think of your friend? To know how to be generous as a gift giver, you need to know the person. You need to know how they think and feel and what's important to them. You need to understand the context, the occasion. You need to understand your own time and finances. And you need the skill to balance these. The WAs I've worked with have all been generous, just like any good teacher is. What they were giving was their time. They were giving the time it took to read and analyze a paper. The time at the conference. A half an hour roughly, but a half an hour for all students? What if the YE was really confused, or panicked, or depressed? What if she asked for more help? What if she asked you to read another draft? How do you balance this need with your own scarce time, the paper you have to finish? But generosity with time spills into another ethical choice. Being generous with your time for one student may mean less time with another student. So there's the question of how you distribute your time among the YEs. There's the question of fairness or justice that you're always confronting. So WAs are frequently figuring out how to balance generosity and fairness, two good principles that are often in conflict. And on top of this, they're figuring out what fairness means in this case. Does it mean treating equals equally? The classic Aristotelian definition of justice. But what does that mean? Does that mean giving equal time to all students? Or giving more time to students who need it the most? Or giving more time to students who are working the hardest? To know how and when to give your time, to know what is fair and how to be fair, to know when to be directive and when to allow WAEs to choose. All these things demand something else. A good WA needs to learn how to be empathetic, to understand and feel what the WAE is thinking. And learning to be empathetic demands learning how to listen. And such good listening is not easy. Here's another reflection from recent reflection from the WA. We talked last semester about my tendency to overtalk when I get nervous or feel the need to justify my criticism. During the semester, I feel like I threw questions back on the YEs in order to make them think critically about what we were discussing and even to ensure that I wouldn't appropriate the paper. At the beginning of this semester, I noticed that I was resorting back to overtalking. Probably because I was wanting things I never had had. But what I realized was, again, that I could just let the YEs speak. What I mean by this is address their concerns, ask them what they want to focus on, throw their questions back at them. What a WA learns quickly is that there's no simple rule here. It's not just let them talk and don't interrupt. You have to know when to let the YE talk and when and how to interrupt. You have to know when and how to ask a question, and what questions to ask, and how open-ended or closed-ended they need to be. You have to have your own agenda, but of course, the more you have an agenda, the less you may understand theirs. What do they think their central problem is, but are they right? Is it the grammar, the sentence structure, or are they totally confused about what the assignment even is? To be a good listener, you need to know when and how to be patient, when to say enough. You need to have the imagination to understand why someone else is confused about something you may never have been confused about in your life. Being empathetic is not what would I think and feel in this situation. It's what is the student I am, why I'm thinking and feeling in this situation. So, how do people learn practical wisdom? The first thing that needs to be said is that no one learns practical wisdom in general. It's not like a thing that you suddenly get, and then when you have it, you go around applying it in every situation like a cookie cutter on dough. No, rather, you learn practical wisdom to be a friend or a parent or a spouse or a teacher or a doctor or a community organizer, and wow. You learn it in those particular activities, and though there's some spillover from one practice to another, practical wisdom is different in different practices. And you learn it, not surprisingly, by practicing. You learn it by trying to do the right thing in a specific practice. So, I finally asked Dr. Elizabeth Galfberg, one of Michael's teachers at the Cambridge Hospital, why she avoided using the word teaching. Why she and others always used awkward phrases like provoking the student or causing judgment to be learned. The student, she said, could be taught certain medical knowledge, best practices, the skills needed to do an exam or surgery, but they couldn't be taught to be perceptive. They couldn't be taught to care, to get inside the thoughts and feelings of their patients. To work out a treatment program and encourage a patient to follow it. That's not something that could be easily taught. You can't teach them to deliver bad news, at least not if teaching means telling or providing rules or giving knowledge to students. Students who are treating patients under me in my clinic, said Dr. Peter Cohen, also at Cambridge Hospital, the students who are treating patients under me in my clinic at first come to me and ask, what would I do in such and such a situation? I try not to answer. I come back at them and ask them what they would do. It may not be exactly what I would do, but it might be reasonable. I ask them, if we try that, do we have any way to measure whether it will work? Is it a kind of treatment that the patient is likely to follow? If they're unsure, they go home, they look up everything on the topic, and then they bring it back to our discussions. Notice how Dr. Cohen talks about students who are treating patients under me in my clinic. That actually is not usual for third-year medical students at most medical schools. Because at most medical schools, third-year students normally shadow doctors and senior residents as they rush in and out of hospital rooms on morning rounds, and once in a while get asked an occasional question. But the docs in the Cambridge program came to think that young doctors in training needed something more than this kind of experience. So they designed a new third-year program, the one that Michael Morse was in, the one that I was actually there to study. And that program put medical students in clinics every day of the week for a half a day with the same doctor. Same doctor on Monday, different doctor on Tuesday. There they work in a one-on-one relationship with their doctors who coach and mentor them, not for an 8-week rotation, but for the whole year, and not with patients who they never see again, but with 15 patients who they're assigned to for the whole year. It's a bit like the difference between working with a different student every night in a writing clinic, often on an emergency basis, and working with 10 students in a class for the whole term. Notice that at the heart of this medical training is hands-on experience, but with doctors committed to model good practice and coach students, doctors as mentors. But in addition to this learning through practice, there's also the class that all third-year students must take, which is called Patient Doctor 3, and it's taught by Elizabeth Galfberg. The more she told me about it, the more I saw parallels between it and the English 1C class that Jill Gladstein teaches to the incoming WAs. I was puzzled at first why Dr. Galfberg held her very first class in the Sackler Museum of Art in Cambridge. She explained to me that when the students first meet there, she gives them their first assignment. If you brought a depressed friend to the museum, what work would you show them? Or, what would you show a friend who had difficulty empathizing? Each student then wanders the museum to choose a picture, and then has to explain to the class why they picked it. I don't care what they picked, said Dr. Galford, as long as it gets them to be self-aware and more mindful. Mindful, I asked? Self-reflective, she said. One of the things I want them to learn in this course is to observe their emotional reactions to patients, to colleagues, to illnesses, to the ways they communicate, to how they respond to personal vulnerability and failure or react under stress. They need to be mindful practitioners who have the kind of sensitive, confident, open relations with patients that they'll need to be successful healers. Subsequent classes that Liz Galford gives involve a range of issues the students will have to face as doctors. How to balance patient rights with patient well-being. How to meet the emotional needs of dying patients. How to assume responsibility after a medical error. How to deliver bad news. Liz Galford has students read articles and research studies and examine what ethicists have to say. She uses case studies, stories, poems to get the students to express their feelings and learn how to empathize. She shows them videos of doctors facing some of the dilemmas they will face. She brings in other doctors to role play some of the issues. She has the students work with professional actors who are trained to be patients. But the most important thing that Liz Galford does is have the students talk about their own experiences with patients. And the thing that makes it possible, explained Galford, is the way she and others constructed the Cambridge program. Because the students in the Cambridge program are actually having these experiences because they actually have their own patients. So even in Liz Galford's class, she understands that you can't simply teach the practical wisdom it takes to be a good teacher. Just like Jill Gladstein can't teach it in English 1C, the gateway course that OOAs still have to take. For example, here's what you won't see if you look at Jill Gladstein's syllabus. Lesson number 1, rules for teaching good grammar. Lesson number 2, rules for teaching coherent paragraph writing. Lesson number 3, rules for teaching the skills of writing an opening paragraph. And then, of course, you won't see the practical wisdom section with titles like rules for when and how to be directive, rules for good listening, rules for when to ask and tell. Rules and guidelines are helpful when you're first learning technical skills or ethical skills. Don't talk too much. Ask the student what she thinks the point of the paper is. Don't try to get the WAI to fix everything. Such rules and guidelines are what people in the education department like to call scaffolds. They're the structures or routines that give you a firm place to stand when you're getting started. They take you the first few steps. But then the general rules hit the realities of the particular person in the particular paper. You have to improvise. And to improvise, you have to get inside the hearts and minds of the students you're working with, which means that you have to learn how to be empathetic. It's the scaffolds that will get you started, but it's the actual experience, the practice, that will teach you. But how do you learn through experience? Well, you learn by watching experts model good practice. You learn by being coached and mentored. And above all, you learn through trial and error. You learn by making mistakes. You have to get it wrong to get it right, and that's very painful. So you have to be reflective enough to recognize those mistakes and have the courage to pick yourselves up and try again. As Will Rogers famously once said, the only way you learn good judgment is through experience. And most of that experience is the exercise of bad judgment. If you think about this process, it quickly becomes clear why no teacher can teach you practical wisdom. And what's so brilliant about the WA program is that Jill and her predecessors figured out ways to cause wisdom to be learned. And they did this by building on some of the research in the cognitive learning sciences about the best practices used in the professional world. Most of you who are currently WAs know this. Those of you who were WAs experienced some of this, and some of it may be new to you. Let's take the English 1C course. That's still the gateway to be a WA. It's organized around the notion that students will only learn if theory and practice are combined. Reflection and practice, it's sometimes called. WAs are reading the literature on teaching, learning, and writing pedagogy, but they're doing that at the same time that they're practicing. They get sample papers to evaluate in class. They observe experienced writing associates during tutorial sessions. They write reflection papers about what they saw, and they talk these over with Jill. But they're not only watching the practice being modeled, they're also working as apprentice WAs from the first day they get into that class. And of course, we need an acronym for them, which are the WAs in training, or the weights. So the weights are then paired with senior WAs. You have to be inside the school. So the weights are paired with senior WAs, and there's the opportunity then for mentorship. They write reflection papers on this experience too. And part of English 1C is a discussion, right in class, a discussion of what they're practicing. So students need to talk about what the decisions are that they're making. What did you do when someone was really quiet or really defensive? How did you handle the situation with so-and-so for whom English was a second language? Does it sometimes hurt a writer if we keep encouraging more revision? Notice that reflective practice is not just a slogan. It's not just an exhortation that someone says, be more reflective about what you do. It's something that students learn by doing it, because the structure Jill's created demands constant practice in doing it. I can't overemphasize the importance of learning to be reflective. You can't learn through trial and error unless you learn to recognize your errors as they happen, to figure out what went wrong in this particular case. And English 1C is structured to cause reflection to be learned. But it turns out that English 1C is just the beginning, because every time a WA sits down for a conference with a student, that WA is learning through trial and error. In trying to help others improve their writing, the WAs are honing their own technical skills, but they're also learning how to listen, and when to be directive, and when to interrupt. And they learn that because when they get it wrong, they immediately experience the consequences of getting it wrong. The why is confused, or discouraged, or clams up, or gets upset. It spurs reflection. What did I do? The very process encourages WAs to be reflective and to learn how to be empathetic. They know when they're not because they see the communication breaking down. And here's another important feature of the program. As they practice, WAs don't practice alone. One of Jill's important innovations has been to make reflection and practice an integral part of the structure, even after the WAs leave English 1C. The WAs in the Writing Center write reflection pieces about their conferences with students, then Jill reads them and comments on them. At the end of each semester, WAs write a reflection paper which they turn into Jill. What were your goals? What did you learn? What do you want to learn? Then there's also the feedback from the students in the courses, and Jill brings the feedback and the reflection papers together in the end of term meeting. Each WA has an end of term meeting at the end of each term, and they sit down and say, okay, what needs to be worked on? What are your goals for next term going to be? And the mentoring and evaluation that Jill is doing in this systematic way is also being supplemented by faculty members who are working with the WAs who are teaching their classes. And this ongoing membership is not simply teacher to student. From the very beginning, WAs are encouraged to mentor each other with this peer mentoring. And that's now become an integral part of the program. So, if you ever stick your head into the Writing Center, which many of you must do, and I sometimes do because my office is upstairs, you find out that it's not only a drop-in center for students looking for help, but it's a place where the WAs teach each other by watching each other, by sharing difficulties and effective practices, by exchanging stories. by getting advice. This constant talk over what has worked and what has not helps transform the daily practices of WAS into a powerful educational experience. Let me conclude by mentioning one other way that the WA program causes wisdom to be learned. It's something that you don't hear talked about, but I actually think it's the secret ingredient of the program's success. Think about the typical situation a WA finds himself or herself in. They're taking 4, sometimes more, courses. They're inundated with their own papers and exams. They're stretched thin with organizations they're running or sports teams they're dedicated to. So in the midst of this typically stressed out sophomore life, why is it that they take the time and so often the care to work with fellow students on their thinking and writing? It's clearly not the money. And for many, it's not simply a sense of duty or obligation. Such language implies that there's a tension between desire on the one hand and duty or obligation on the other. It implies that on the one hand, there is the self-interest of the WA and its intention with the obligation to help another. It implies that there's a split between egoism and altruism, and that the WAs are sacrificing their egoistic self-interest to their responsibility for someone else. We're all torn by such tensions and splits from time to time, but what strikes me about most of the WAs is that they actually take great satisfaction, even joy, in doing well what they are doing. Here's an excerpt from the final reflection of a third-year WA. WA has been amazing, rewarding, frustrating, exhausting, and exhilarating, sometimes all at once. I think I'm a better communicator, a better teacher, a better writer, a better student, and a better friend for having been a WA. It's been a real delight to work with and learn from an amazing group of fellow WAs and WAEs, to get to know people I would never have met otherwise, and to learn about how to help people become better at the skills they need. Not it's been a real duty to be a WA, not a real obligation, but a real delight. You get great pleasure when you've been able to ask the right questions, when you've been able to explain something just right, when the WAE gets it. What gives you pleasure is doing well an activity you know to be valuable. You've learned to love what is best, and it is this love for what is best that motivates so many of you. Being motivated by a love of what's best is the mark of a good teacher. It's the mark of a good professional. It's the mark of a person of good character. What gives you pleasure, to paraphrase Aristotle, is doing the right thing and doing it well and feeling the right way about it. What frustrates or annoys you are the obstacles that interfere with good work. What makes you angry is unfairness or injustice. All these emotions, pleasure, joy, frustration, annoyance, anger, are the right emotions to have. The way Jill and her predecessors have structured the WA program here at Swarthmore has caused WAs to learn the right emotions. They have probably never said, Jill and her predecessors at least, have probably never said to the WAs, you need to learn to love what is best. And if one WA said this to another, eyes would probably roll. Yes, even here at Swarthmore. But Jill and the WAs don't need to say this to each other. WAs learn to love what is best by practicing it in a community where loving what is best is valued, where other WAs and their teachers are constantly struggling to get it right, where they're modeling a passion for excellence at what they're doing. We learn to do the right thing and to feel the right way about it by practicing it with others who feel the same way. Nobody set out to design a Writing Associates program that would cause Swarthmore WAs to learn practical wisdom. But people like Jill and Betsy and Lisa and Tom figured out that this was exactly what a WA had to learn in order to be a good WA. And over time, they gradually figured out, in fact, they invented a program that works exactly because it causes practical wisdom to be learned. It's really rather brilliant, and everyone in this room is thankful to you for it. Two questions? Or comments? Observations? Reflections? Yes. Why don't you introduce yourselves as you do it?
Sure. So I'm Matt Davis from the class of 1989. I'm a pediatrician and I'm a policy researcher at the University of Michigan. And I've been struck many times by how impractical the wisdom is offered by many folks in the ivory tower. That's thrown at us all the time at the university by the state, for example, who wants to increase funding. So I wonder about you, who I would say, since the time I was here, it's been very practical in your wisdom. As you think about academia today, and the questions that we try to answer, how practical are we actually?
You could be asking how practically wise teachers are in their teaching, or you could be asking how much we cause practical wisdom to be learned among the students. Which of those two are you asking?
I'm asking your perception about whether academia is about causing practical wisdom to be learned, or about causing impractical wisdom to be learned.
I actually think that, let's separate out two kinds of things that we teach. Let's separate out, I could get in trouble with this, but let's separate out the intellectual virtues from the moral virtues. And let's say that the intellectual virtues would include a passion for learning, caring about what you're writing, knowing when to trust someone in authority, a teacher, and when to challenge someone in authority, knowing how much information you need in order to prove something, coming to value the truth. Those are the intellectual virtues. And let's say that the moral virtues were the kinds of virtues that you needed for your social relationships with people, like loyalty or generosity, humility, caring, kindness. I would say that on the intellectual virtues, I think colleges, certainly small liberal arts colleges, I don't want to speak outside my realm of expertise. Actually, this is a complicated thought. I actually think that they're good at teaching practical wisdom, but they don't know it. I think that faculty members are modeling and mentoring students in the wisdom you need to exercise the intellectual virtues all the time, but they're doing it quite accidentally and quite unintentionally, and sometimes not so well, but they're doing it. Not all of them, but they're doing it. And I think the whole idea, when a faculty member sits down with a student to help a student write a paper better, the faculty member has got to be a little bit like a WA, although it's too bad they haven't had the WA training. That's probably what I would say to that. But when it comes to teaching the wisdom that you need to practice the social virtues well, I think we're much less good on that. And I sometimes think we're a bit impractical, as you said, on that. In that sense, we're not preparing people to be the kinds of citizens or colleagues or friends or doctors that you need. Of course, we're not giving them that technical professional training too. But I would take as an example the number of times in a classroom, for example. Classroom is a great place where a teacher could be teaching the wisdom to exercise moral virtues. Because all the time in the classroom, students interrupt other students. Students dominate discussions. Students can be rude to each other, although it's Swarthmore, not that much. Students can talk too much. Faculty members can come in unprepared for a class or blow something when they try to correct somebody. Those are incredible opportunities to be teaching good judgment to students, not so much about the intellectual virtues, but about the moral virtues. And it would be teaching them in a way that would be authentic to the aim or the telos of the university, because it wouldn't be, oh, I have a responsibility as a professor to teach students to be good citizens, so I'm going to build practical wisdom about moral virtues into my class so they'll be ready when they go out. It wouldn't be that external or instrumental. It would be, I have a responsibility to teach students how to talk to each other in order to have the kind of class at Swarthmore that is necessary for students to actually learn. So that the aim of the class and of the discussion almost demands teachers who can teach students the practical wisdom to make the judgments they need to be good students. So you don't have to say, well, I'm doing it for some external cause, just to make education work well. I don't think many of us, including myself until more recently, so I'm not throwing rocks at my colleagues, I'm throwing rocks at my former self here too. I don't think are conscious of that, and we can let a classroom, a seminar discussion section just deteriorate, and we throw up our hands and say, oh, isn't that just, didn't work, must have been something in my life, something in the student's life, the mix of the students. But the idea that we could go home and say, or even better, talk with our colleagues, as a few of my colleagues now have begun to do, that doesn't happen a lot, say, my class just isn't going well. Let's reflect, you don't have to use that word, I'm using that because it's the word out there in the literature, but let's talk about it, let's think about it, help me brainstorm about it. What's happening? What did you do when you faced this? But in do it, the idea of reflection and practice is you're doing it after the first week in class, not what went wrong with these last 14 weeks, but you're correcting yourself and you're trying to figure out what are happening in those dynamics. Is it something the students are doing? Is it something I'm doing? What can I do to correct that? And what can I do to turn that into a teaching opportunity? That would build a kind of practical wisdom and moral engagement into the everyday life of a classroom. We don't do that well, in general. There are some faculty that do that well, but in general we don't, and we don't even talk about doing it. I mean, the language that I'm using now, what I'm saying to you, this is not a discussion that goes on amongst faculty at many schools. So that's a complicated answer, but that's what I think. So, some hands up earlier, Molly?
I'm Molly Wilder. I was class of 09. I'm currently in a master's in philosophy program at Tufts University, and I'm also the coordinator for their graduate writing consulting program. And I studied with Professor Sharp, and my philosophy is actually still very in a similar line. And what I was wondering, and what I've been grappling with, is, so you said that WAS see the communication breaking down. And I think that's true. I think WAS can see when the communication breaks down. But it amazes me how many people can't see the communication breaking down, or don't know. They might see that something is going wrong, but they have no idea what it is. Sometimes I wonder whether it's particularly philosophers that are really bad at this. But I wonder if there's anything you can do about that, anything that you can say about that, whether you can, not have rules, but have, is there something that even people that don't automatically see it could understand or grasp.
When you're posing that question, are you saying what another WA could do, what I could do, what a teacher could do? Who's the subject in this?
So I want to be able to explain this to anyone. And I think that WAs are to some degree picked because they can already see it. So I'm wondering how you can teach this to someone that doesn't already see it.
Not surprisingly, as you would predict, I would say there's no general answer that I could get to that.
So not
But-
general,
but-
but kind of
but,
how we go about doing that.
What's, for better or for worse, the older I've got and face these problems, the ways that I've increasingly used to do this is to talk about the particular case, not in general. And that puts a burden on me if it happens in class to either stop the class and say, what's happening here? Or let's talk about this. Or what I'm more likely to do, since it takes sometimes more courage than I have to do that, is to ask a student or students to come into my office. But do that very quickly at the end of class and talk about what happened. What were they thinking? What was that comment about? What impact do they think that had on other people in the class? I mean, I had this recently in the practical wisdom class that I was teaching with Barry when I noticed that just one or two students were laughing at comments other students made, but the other students weren't being funny. And there was something happening there, and I got really worried that laughter was going to silence the students that were talking. And but I didn't make a classroom issue out of that. But I also, in doing it, tried to relive the instance with the person and have them talk to me about it. What were they thinking? Why did they do that? Do they even remember doing it? As opposed to my teaching them a lesson, right?
So you're modeling how you saw it for them.
And asking them to try to remember for me, or I'm trying to get inside their heads and have them tell me a story about it. Just as you all, when you do good wine, will often turn to the student and say, well, what is the point you're trying to make here? As opposed to, the point I think you're trying to make here is this, and you're not making it well. Let them tell it to you.
So you don't want to just tell them this is how you should see it, but rather understand how they really see it and maybe find a way to bridge the two together.
I guess what I'm thinking about this is there's a little bit of some of the things that you learn through trial and error about parenting too, which is to, Johnny, how did you think Sarah felt when you said that? Because you don't want to tell Johnny how you think Sarah felt. You want him to learn how to empathize, and you want the people to be able to learn the process of being reflective about what they're doing. But if it's not anchored to a particular case or an instance, if it's just a malaise that you sense, it's very hard to do it. But because what you say is so true, that some people aren't even conscious of it, the simple act of bringing it to their consciousness, even without chastising them for it, often sets in motion a whole train of thought. Especially if the teacher asks you to come into their office and think about it.
Yeah.
Do it. But it's a great question, and it's a thing that one does slowly, and maybe have to do a few times, just the same way that when you're teaching people how to write, it's not just their eyes open and they get it and then it's done. Sometimes have to correct it. Others?
Or maybe we want to continue this over
Would you like to
food
do
and
that?
drinks. Thank you very much, Eva.
You're welcome.